Well, welcome everyone to today's msexchange.org webinar, another in a series of regular informational webinars hosted by msexchange.org, designed to deliver helpful and timely information to the MS Exchange community. Today's event is sponsored by Trend Micro. Trend Micro is a global leader in security software and strives to make the world safe for exchanging digital information. Built on 26 years of experience, Trend Micro solutions for consumers, businesses, and governments provide layered data security to protect information on mobile devices, endpoints, gateways, servers, and the cloud. Trend Micro enables the smart protection of information with innovative security technology that is simple to deploy and manage and fits an evolving ecosystem. I'm Roger, your moderator, and before introducing our speakers for today, I need to let you know that we are recording today's event. All participant lines are muted. If you need any assistance during the event, please use the questions or the chat feature. Send me a comment and I'll try to give you assistance. We also encourage your questions and comments at any point during the presentations. We'll collect those and we will have our speakers address as many as possible at the end. Our speakers for today are John Clay and Michael Osterman. John Clay is responsible for managing marketing messages and external publications of all the threat research and intelligence within Trend Micro, as well as different core technologies. As an accomplished public speaker with hundreds of speaking sessions around the globe, John focuses on the threat landscape and the use of big data in protecting against today's sophisticated threats. John is also a volunteer speaker for the Trend Micro Internet Safety for Kids and Family program. Michael Osterman is the principal of Osterman Research, one of the leading analyst firms in the messaging and collaboration space, providing research, analysis, white papers, and other services to companies like Hewlett-Packard, IBM, Google, EMC, Symantec, and many others. Michael is a speaker at industry and vendor-sponsored events on the topics of archiving, messaging, social media, and other messaging and collaboration-focused issues. And now I'll turn it over to Michael to get us started.
Well, Roger, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today with John and with all of you as well. So really what we're going to talk about is the threat landscape. If you're in IT at all, even if you're not in IT, you're familiar with the threats that we all face, really on a wide variety of fronts, whether it's phishing or spam or malware or ransomware, what have you. We're all very familiar with really the growing variety of threats that are out there. Just some stats on the current state of cybercrime. Basically, the World Economic Forum places the global cost of cybercrime at about $445 billion last year. The Ponemon Institute estimated that just for the typical 10,000 employee company, they're going to spend $3.7 million per year dealing with just phishing attacks, a very common form of attack that virtually every company of every size and in every industry faces. So, for a 10,000 employee company, obviously a good-sized company, they're going to spend millions of dollars dealing just with the phishing attacks, let alone everything else they have to face. Vade Secure, for example, estimates that the cost of just a single spear phishing attack against a company with $100 million in revenue, and if they suffer a breach of 50,000 records, is going to be $7.2 million. And that's not just in the loss of the information itself, but it's also the bad PR, it's the credit reporting services that you have to provide. It's really all of the costs that go along with that, which really can extend for many years. Just as one more stat here, the FBI estimates that since 2014, BEC, or business email compromise attacks, have cost victims more than $5 billion. So we're looking at really a wide variety of different types of cybercrime on a growing variety of fronts. I mean, we're seeing ransomware, for example, just at astronomical proportions and getting worse. So these problems are all, sort of advancing on a number of different fronts, and it's becoming more and more difficult for companies to address all of these things if they don't have the right technologies, the right processes, the right training in place, and so forth. So, we see more and more of these types of things happening, largely because companies are not adequately protected. Certainly some are, but many of them are not. So this came from a research project that we did in April, talking to our survey panel, and these were from mid-sized and large companies primarily. What we found is that over a third of organizations had experienced some sort of an email phishing attack that had successfully infected their network with malware. Now, virtually everybody receives, some sort of phishing every day, but a lot of people, won't click on the link, they won't open the attachment, and so that's not really counted as a successful phishing excursion into the company. But we found it's over a third of organizations actually were infected with some sort of malware. Maybe it was ransomware as a result of phishing. 35% experienced malware infiltration through some unknown source. And that's particularly damaging because you got infected with some sort of malware and you have no idea where it came from. So you don't even know where to look first. Did it come through email? Did it come through social media? Web surfing, a USB stick, somebody accessing an unprotected, source from home. There could be a wide variety of these sources, and if you don't know what they are, it's going to be more difficult to remediate. We found that about a third of organizations we surveyed experienced a business email compromise attack that penetrated their defenses, but really didn't trick anyone. But we did find that for about 15% of companies, they did experience a BEC attack that did penetrate their defenses, and it successfully tricked somebody in the organization, maybe like a CEO, a CFO, what have you. We found that 30% of organizations had files encrypted from a successful ransomware attack, and this number is probably quite a bit higher because we did this survey before the WannaCry attack that happened in early May. We also, won't go through the rest of these, but, we found that there really were a wide variety of other types of problems, data breaches, data leakage, and so forth. So, we're finding that the vast majority of companies that we survey, and we find this consistently across every survey that we do, is experiencing some sort of a successful attack, whether it's ransomware or malware infiltration, or attacks through web surfing, data loss of intellectual property. These are very common events. And depending on the survey we do, we find that only anywhere from 13 to 20% of organizations have not had one of these attacks. And we think that that number is probably high because a lot of organizations may not want to report publicly that they have had some sort of a breach or data loss or malware infiltration. So, suffice it to say that the vast majority of us are experiencing, some sort of cybersecurity problem. So this is something that impacts just about every one of us. And the problems really are getting worse. What we found is, in the survey we asked, are your cybersecurity defenses protecting you better over time? Are they worsening? Are things staying about as bad as they were? And what we find is that for things like phishing and spear phishing, a lot of organizations report things are getting better. Either their training is paying off and that users are more sensitive to the kinds of things they see coming through email, for example, or their technology is getting better and able to block these things. But for 15% of companies, things are actually getting worse. They are experiencing more phishing attacks, more spear phishing. And for 35%, things just aren't getting any better. We find that, for about half of companies, it's either the status quo or worse. But then you get into things like ransomware. And again, a significant proportion of companies report that things are getting better, but most report things are not, that things are actually getting worse or at least not getting any better. And then you get into things like business email compromise, where things really are getting quite bad. A lot of companies have been victimized. Many have been victimized literally to the tune of tens of millions of dollars through just a small number of BEC attacks. So by and large, there are some companies that are experiencing sort of an improvement in their cybersecurity situation, but for most companies, things are either not getting any better or they're getting worse. So what's interesting is if you can go to this, the link you see here, the Global Risks Landscape 2017, what we see is that, if you plot just a wide variety of threats, whether they're cyber related or not, in terms of the impact versus the likelihood, you see, that cyber attacks and data fraud or theft are really, much higher on the likelihood scale. The impact of these can vary widely based on the industry an organization is involved in, how well they're they're trained, how good their technology is, and so forth. But really, the likelihood of these things happening is really very high. Now, we talk a lot about energy prices or asset bubbles or extreme weather events or weapons of mass destruction, whatever the case may be. But things like cyber attacks and data loss are actually much more likely to occur, largely because most organizations have an enormous attack surface. It's not only every user, but it's every device and it's every venue that people are operating from. So these problems are really very serious, and they are getting worse over time for a significant proportion of us out there. So just a few examples here. I won't go through all these, but looking at, for example, the GoldenEye ransomware. It's targeting German speakers in HR departments in German-speaking companies using a two-part attack. First, the cyber criminal will send a PDF file that gets delivered in an email, usually contains some sort of a cover letter. And then the second attachment is an Excel file that will use malicious macros to load ransomware by asking the victim to click a link. And what's interesting is that even if users are trained not to do these things, not to open attachments or not to click on links, many users still do, largely because people tend to get rushed. They're not as careful as they need to be. They're not as skeptical as they need to be. They don't check header information in an email, for example. And so a lot of organizations fall victim to things like phishing, spear phishing, ransomware, largely because users are just not quite careful enough. And also the technology to filter out this stuff before it ever reaches end users is not adequate in many cases. Another, just one more example here. There's a new ransomware technique that offers some sort of a twist on social engineering by basically asking people to give up their friends. If they send a link to their contacts so that they can spread the ransomware, then they get their files back. So, it's sort of an insidious form of sort of a payoff, if you will, to get people to decrypt their files, and a lot of people are falling victim to this. So, bottom line here is that the vast majority of organizations are getting victimized, users are not careful enough, and the technology in many cases that organizations have deployed just is not adequate to protect them from the various threats that they face. Okay, John, I'm going to hand things over to you now.
Excellent, Mike. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is dive a little bit deeper into business email compromise. What are the tactics? What are the tools used by the criminals who are perpetrating this? We'll have some stats. A lot of the stats that I'm going to say here come from Trend Micro's back-end data information. So a lot of these are real examples of what we have seen targeting our customers. And then we're going to talk about some of the things you can do as an organization to help protect yourselves from this threat. So let's kind of get started. If you look at business email compromise, there's really 5 versions of and tactics that are used by the criminals. The first one is what we call the bogus invoice scheme. This is where the cyber criminal is going to compromise an email account, an employee's email account. That compromised account is then going to send notifications to their customers, to their vendors, asking for payments to be transferred to the cyber criminal account. So they're going to send an invoice like they're coming from the original organization, say, hey, can you pay this invoice to their customers? The customers will then pay the invoice, but it goes to the cyber criminal. By far the biggest one is version 2, which is what we call CEO fraud. This is where the cyber criminal is going to pose as a company executive and email somebody in finance. That email is going to ask that finance person to wire transfer funds into the cyber criminal's account. And that could be a mule account in the region, and then that mule will take that account, take that information or the money and pay off. He gets his cut and then he sends it to the cyber criminal and they get the money. But another one is just account compromise. This is where they compromise an employee account used to request payments. The recipients transfer payments to the cyber criminal account again, and the criminal receives that money. There's a fourth one that people probably aren't very familiar with, which is attorney impersonation. A lot of organizations have third-party attorneys that they use. And the cyber criminal is going to pose as a lawyer and emails the finance person inside that organization, and finance sends the funds to the cyber criminal. And again, they're going to say, hey, you guys owe us this money. then they wire transfer the money into their account, into that cyber criminal's account who's posing as a external lawyer, outsourced lawyer. And then the last one is really data theft, and this is becoming more and more of an issue where, you know, these criminals behind it, obviously they're looking for money, but they also recognize that if they can steal data as well as part of the scam, they can use that data in other ways. So they'll, again, compromise an employee email account. The compromised accounts used to request PII data of other employees or executives. The PII is sent to the cyber criminal account, and then they can do other compromises, right? They can perpetrate fraud against that employee or executive. They can do a whole lot of damage in that case. And when you look at payroll, this was an actual attack that we worked on. Usually the business email compromise attacker is going to ask for the W-2 copy directly, but in this case, it actually showed the attacker asked for login privileges of the payroll management system service that that organization was using. So you can see in the email, dear, hi HR director, please may I know what the self-service registration code of our ADP portal is. Thanks, CFO. Again, these emails are very simple emails. One of the challenges that a lot of organizations have with business email compromise is, in many cases, the email doesn't have any payload. There's no attachment, there's no URLs. It's just trying to get somebody, an employee, to take action and do something that they may do on a regular basis, but do it in a way that helps the cyber criminal. So you can see here they sent a phishing page that asked for the login ID and password of their ADP service. So again, they will do some analysis of the target organization. They'll understand what processes you use, what software you're using, so they gather intelligence about the organization that they want to target, and they'll know a lot of information about you. They also will do analysis of the victims that they're trying to compromise. So they know, in a lot of cases, they identify if an executive is out of the country or out of the office on vacation. They will send these emails during those times as well. When we looked at some of the attack sources, so these are IPs, where the emails are originating from, right, the email source. And what we found was interesting was the top is the U.S., so by far not really any interesting thing there, because the U.S. has very good infrastructure, so they'll compromise accounts. You can see here a lot of the IPs belong to hosting services or VPN services located in the U.S. The interesting one, though, is this number 2, is Nigeria. We see a lot of the business email compromise are coming out of Nigeria and West Africa. This country is typically going to be talked about. We recently released a report on West Africa underground, and with a lot of information about that as well. So Nigeria is a big one for perpetrating this fraud. And when we looked at it, one of the things we noticed that some of the source IPs, specific source IPs, are used to do attacks on different days, different locations. So this was an attack we saw where the IP was originating out of Europe, and you can see on May 11th, 2017, they targeted an Australia company as well as a New Zealand company. On May 21st, they targeted another Australia company from the same IP. On the 22nd, they targeted a California company, or a Canadian company, Canadian company, on the 22nd of May from the same IP again. And then finally, they targeted another New Zealand company on May 23rd. So you can see across a number of days, they targeted different locations, organizations in different parts of the world, all from the same IPs. And we'll talk a little bit further about how we can use that to our advantage. When we analyzed some of the business email compromise emails, specific emails that we saw coming into our customer base, you can see here that it has been ticking up over since August of 2016. These numbers aren't huge, but we have to understand that business email compromise tends to be more targeted in approach. This isn't like mass spam that you see out there for ransomware, for example. These are because they have to do a lot of analysis of the organization. They have to get information about the organization. They have to understand their targets. They have to know who they're going to target. So it's more like a targeted attack approach. So as such, you're going to see much less volume, but it doesn't mean that it's any worse than, say, a ransomware. So like, for example, ransomware, the typical ransom right now is 1 to 2 Bitcoins, which is somewhere around $3,000 to $5,000, and then but business email compromise usually on average is around 140,000 in losses. So it's a much more bigger issue for organizations. Then we have, now let's talk about the emails themselves. Who are they targeting? Who are they using to target their employees? So when you look at the email that is being sent, who is it being sent from? And this is what we see on a regular basis. Typically, the CEO is going to be the primary person it's coming from. But you can see here there's directors, there's presidents, general manager. Those titles are typically what they're going to use. An interesting one you can see here is the retired CEO. We saw some cases where the former CEO was used in the attack. So kind of an interesting play there. Not sure if that was effective. Probably, hopefully not, but they are trying a little bit of everything. But you see the C levels are really represented here, and people very high in the chain. And part of the reason for that is because it's a trust thing. They're trying to abuse trust, right? If you get an email from your C level, you're likely going to want to take action because you don't want to not do something that your CEO or CFO tells you to do. One of the things we see, again, they're changing a lot of the tactics. They're trying to look at ways that they can get the content of their mail body confused, to confuse the content scan engine. So again, some of the traditional technologies, messaging technologies, security products, may be looking at using content scanning engines of the email body. But you can see here they have some hidden code, hidden links in characters inside this. So if you look at the message at the top, it just says, please organize an immediate funds transfer. But if you look in the lower left, you can see that they added a hidden character I in between every word in the sentences. And that allows them to do mess up some of the content scanning engines because they will look and see a lot of that information there. Now let's shift a little bit and talk about who's most targeted inside an organization, which recipients are targeted. CFO is a big one, so it's usually CEO to CFO. The CEO requests a fund transfer by the CFO to approve it and get it done. But you can see, again, Director of Finance, Financial Controller, Financial Accountant, Finance Director, anybody who has the ability to authorize and perform a wire transfer is who is going to be targeted inside your organization. So that's going to be typical recipients there. Here's just some common email subject we saw. Again, these things are very simple, request, transfer, urgent, use, transfer request, etc. We also are starting to see the localized languages being used. Obviously, here in the U.S., we are mostly English speaking. Unfortunately, English is still the predominant language used in these emails. But you can see here they're starting to branch out. Norway, Poland, France, Swiss, Denmark, Sweden. They're using their languages to perpetrate crime because we're starting to see an uptick in this crime against European organizations. We also noticed that they're starting to use financial language in a lot of their email messages just to try and build authority of those email messages, right? So you see here /CHAPS, payment, RTGS, NEFT, TF. The fraudsters are really going to use those new topics, new terms, and regularly to try and entice that financial employee that they know that it is a legitimate request. One of the tactics that they use is using free email accounts, fraudulent free email accounts. So we observed a lot of use of this in many of the attacks across the world. this case study, we saw one of the email accounts conducted 13 separate BEC attacks in 2017 so far. It varied across the world, whether it was, in the U.S. or Europe or Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, across different industries. So they're not targeting a specific industry. They are going after multiple different types of organizations. And the frequency is very low. Again, perhaps that's for easy managing that single fraudulent account, but they will use that same account in many cases. Just like the IP that we saw earlier in the attacks, they used a single IP. These guys might like to reuse these things. They don't want to have to recreate or create a new account on a regular basis. Now this graph just shows some of the types of BEC emails that we saw going against our customers. We tracked it, and you can see CEO is still predominant. There's two types there. One is really where they're using a spoofed email account. The other is where they're using the actual email account. But you can see supplier swindle, which is the dark red or dark brown here. You can see that started to uptick in April. So we started to see them really doing the supplier swindle scam more effectively in that time. And you can see this, an example of this back in April 28th. You saw, if you saw the news, Google and Facebook were conned out of $100 million in phishing scheme, and they utilized this. This was a supplier swindle scheme where they asked, they got Google and Facebook to send funds, thinking that this was a supplier of theirs asking for money. Luckily, they didn't get the money. They were able to stop the attack using some standard practices, good practices inside these organizations. But they tried to get that $100 million out of them. This chart shows what regions of the world that we saw the business email compromise affect, which regions mostly. This is from 2016, so you can see the U.S. was predominant. So we are the biggest target. Over 37% of the attacks that were seen in 2016 were targeting U.S. companies. But you can see Brazil was represented here. Australia was a big one. India was quite big. Hong Kong, Japan. A lot of the places where financial organizations are located. But again, any organization, industry is going to be targeted. Let's look at some of the trends that we saw in 2017. This comes from April, so we're showing what countries we saw the attacks in April. And you can see the U.S. was number one, with Australia, the UK, but Norway was represented here, and Canada as well was 4 and 5 in April. If we move to May, you can see the U.S. dropped to number 2, and Australia took over number 1. But again, Norway and Canada were represented here as well, and starting to see an uptick in those regions. Now understand that there are many tools available in the underground for these organizations. Again, the attackers coming out of West Africa that perpetrate BEC, we see a lot of them using Limitless and Predator Pane. These are keyloggers. You can see here there's a lot of keyloggers, because again, one of the things they want to do is compromise an email account. So they need to get access to that email account, which means they need the credentials, login credentials. So they'll use a keylogger malware on that machine, that victim's machine. When he enters his username password for his email, or they'll send do a phishing page that asks them to log into their email account. They'll get that access to that. But you can see here there's also mass mailers being used, cryptors being used for the malware, lots of different underground tools being sold for anybody who wants to perpetrate this type of a fraud scheme. So let's shift a little bit and talk about how you can protect yourself and what technology is going to be used to detect business email compromise. Again, the big challenge that people have is, in a lot of cases, is these emails don't have any kind of payload. So let's look at 2 emails. These are actual emails that we had seen. The first is real. A is real. B is not real. It's fake. It's a BEC one. But if you look at it, there is no difference here. The hash, the SHA-1, is the same for both of these. That's where the challenge comes in. If I'm using some of the traditional technologies out there, how do I tell the difference between a real email using content filtering versus the business email compromise, which is the exact same content? So that's where the challenge comes. So let's look at how we would identify the fraudulent email B versus A. So one of the things that you have to look at is both the mail header and the mail content. And again, this is where the challenge comes for the everyday user. He's not going to go look at the mail header typically, right? Your users don't have that expertise. So, they just look at the message. And if the message is legitimate and makes sense, they likely may take action on it. But if we look at the mail header, that's where the behavior of the mail message is going to be found. So we're looking at the behavior. The mail content is what we call where we look at the intention of the email. What is the intent of the email? What is it trying to get the viewer, the user to do when they read the email message? So we look at the header. There were some things that were highlighted in this one that we saw. First and foremost, it was an insecure email provider. So we know, and again, we have reputations on many of the email providers out there because we've been in this business for over 20 years, and we have data on email providers going back, many years. And we know that this email provider is an insecure one. We also noticed that the from domain is forged. The domain you can see here is Compony with an O, and that's what happens in many cases. You guys will register fraudulent domains to use in it. Usually the domains are going to be very close, look or sound very close to it, so they'll use sound squatting, which is if I company versus company, with an A and an O, it sounds the same. Or they'll use typo squatting, where they'll modify, in this case, instead of an A, it's an O, or they may use an I instead of a Y or something. They'll use Unicode, so they'll use Cyrillic letters instead of English letters, etc. And then finally, the reply to is a free email service. So why would the CEO, Wilson, the CEO, want the reply to go to his free email service instead of the corporate email? So all of these are going to obviously help us identify something. Now, when we look at the mail content, there's a couple of things we're going to look at when we look at intent, right? Is there a financial implication? Again, this is associated with business email compromise. So this is not part of this looking at ransomware, for example. We are focusing our technology to identify business email compromise emails. So there's a financial implication typically. There's a call to action, and there's an urgency around it. So these three things all usually are included in these emails. So there's financial component, there's a call to action, and there's an urgency. And what we're doing, and what in the technology that we've been developing over the last year or two, is a combination of machine learning plus expert rules. So the expert rules are going to determine the features. So we look at, and the machine learning is going to determine the weight. So, what features of this email look like they are fraudulent, and then the machine learning is going to determine how fraudulent or how bad are those features that are identified by the expert rules. So when we looked at it, so if you looked at that email, you had your human view, right? And it looked very similar. There was, you couldn't really tell any difference, right? So if we looked at the machine view, we mapped out this email on a chart, you can see the real email versus the fake email, which is in red. The real email is in blue. It almost overlaps, right? So it looks very close if it was just a human to taking a look at this. So this unfortunately is what your employee would see, right? They would look at this and go, yeah, they're real. So I would potentially do something with it. When we add in the expert rules, now we start seeing an anomaly with the fake email, right? So the forged sender gave us some information. The reply to free email service gave us some indication. The email service provider, it was insecure, but wasn't as weighted as high because it wasn't much. The call to action, the financial notification, the urgency, well, that can be somewhat, you can kind of argue that you're going to see those emails on a regular basis inside your organization anyway. People are always sending urgent emails and with requests for call to actions, and there may be some finance in there. So those aren't going to be seen as big of an anomaly or as fake as others. But now when we start adding in some machine learning capabilities and the weighting of these things, we see even a bigger departure for the fake email versus the real email. So the urgency added some weight. We saw the email service provider added some weight. The forward sender reply to. So you can see the difference here between those. So when we look at it, this holistic kind of analysis of the message, both the header and the content, because again, there is no payload, right? We don't have a file to analyze to see if it's malicious. We don't have a URL link to check to see if that's malicious. It's just the content asking somebody to do something and the header information. So what you look at is the human, everything looks normal, but the expert rule starts to see suspect it's suspect that this email might be fraudulent, but we can't really tell. But when you add in that machine learning algorithm, machine learning technology, then we can say, yes, this is detected as a malicious. This is a malicious business email compromise rule. So when we look at it, we're implementing this stuff inside the Trend Micro products, for example, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. But here's just kind of a defense checklist for you. And some of this information comes from the FBI. They have information that you can get on their website. But here's some ideas, not necessarily just that you want to rely on technology only. There is some things you need to do, and first and foremost, it's the employee education, right? Immediate training for those employees who do HR, who may send out W-2 forms to people, or may send financial information about employees or PII data, but also all of your financial employees. So the training on them to have them understand what business email compromise is. We have a great video on our website that kind of gives an overview that you can share with your employees, and they can take a look at it. So just to give them some understanding of how business email compromise works, and also include executives, obviously, because as you saw in those items, who sends it and who receives them, they are coming from these executives. So the executives need to understand that they are being spoofed as well. Second, two-step verification. So whenever an employee receives an email purportedly from an executive, they should contact that person, right? Authenticate that the email is real, especially if it's trying to ask them to wire transfer money. And do not use the reply to, because as you saw in that example, if I reply to, it's going to go to company with an O, and basically the reply is going to go to the criminal, who will then respond and say, yes, this is legitimate. So pick up the phone. That's probably the best way. Text them. Do something that is outside the email messaging platform to verify that that's a real request. The FBI says if you do want to use email, use the forward function instead of reply, again, because they spoof the reply, and it will go to the criminal. But if they forward it and they type in the person's email from your address book, then it will go to that person specifically. Reassess your email security solutions, again, to address these zero payload threats. I'll talk a little bit further later about that. Be careful when posting financial and personal information to social media and company websites. Again, these guys need to do their homework, and so they will they'll use LinkedIn to find out who's working in your organization. They'll be able to find out if they're in finance, because their LinkedIn will give them what job they're using, what job title they are, and then they'll use other maybe social media to identify some things as well about those employees. If possible, register all internet domains that are slightly different. Again, you don't want to be typo squatted or sound squatted by a criminal organization. So if you can and have the resources to register those domains, even though they're fraudulent, they're not fraudulent, but they can be used to fraudulently abuse your organization. But if you own them, they can't use those. And then lastly, if defrauded, we really would request contact your bank, contact local law enforcement. If you're in the U.S., report it to the ic3.gov, which is the FBI's place, so they can help you with your issue. Next, I want to pass it back over to Michael. Michael has some ideas as well that he wanted to share around protection and what you as an organization can do. Michael?
Well, thank you, John. One of the things we wanted to stress is that you need really a very balanced approach to cybersecurity, and that involves not only really good technology, really good processes, but also good training for end users. And what we found is that most users really are not sufficiently careful when they receive a BEC attempt or spear phishing or phishing, what have you. This came from the 2016 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, and what they reported is that the median time between when a cyber criminal will launch an email phishing campaign and the first opening of an email is just 100 seconds. So we're looking at less than 2 minutes between the time a cyber criminal launches a phishing campaign and they get their first potential victim. And also the median time to first click on an attachment is 225 seconds. So we're looking at less than 4 minutes between launching a phishing attack or a spear phishing attack with an attachment and the first opening of that. It's less than 4 minutes, and 30% of phishing messages were opened, up from 23% in 2015. And also, Verizon found that about 1 out of 8 users clicked on the phishing attachment or link, and it was up slightly from the year earlier. So, bottom line here is that users just are not being very careful. A lot of them fall victim. And so you do need, good and adequate training so that people are at least that, first or last, whatever you want to call it, line of defense in the context of protecting your organization. If we can go to the next slide, please. So what we found in the April survey that I mentioned earlier is that users are really not all that well trained. It's not only that the users are not skeptical, they're just not getting very much training from their employers. For example, the human firewall approach, where people are well trained to protect, against opening attachments and clicking on links and so forth. About 52% of organizations never do that. About half of organizations never provide any sort of even a monthly security video to train users on new cybersecurity threats and so forth. About 2 out of 5 organizations never do any sort of phishing tests with their employees. And, sort of the minimal approach, the break room where, you train users over lunch, just more or less on an informal basis. About a third of organizations never do that. And the result, as you see on the right here, is that, most organizations find, and this is from IT's perspective, they find that their users are just not very well trained. Senior executives aren't well trained to detect BEC attacks. Employees aren't well trained to recognize phishing and so forth. So, while you absolutely need good technology, as John described, to protect against phishing and spear phishing and BEC and all the other sorts of cybersecurity threats out there, you also need good training because users, are some level of defense for your organization, and they should be trained appropriately. John, I'll hand it back to you now.
Yeah, no, those are all great points. And what we, one of the things we've always recommended the training aspect. We do have, like I said earlier, there's a video on business email compromise. We have a lot of resources on our website for business email compromise education that can be utilized by organizations to help you guys if you do need support of that. So, but again, you don't want to rely just on your employees to identify these, because as we saw earlier, the emails that they craft are very simple. They usually don't have grammar issues anymore. They don't have spelling issues anymore. The criminals behind it are utilizing people that can build these emails in a way that makes it very creditable. And so it's very hard for an employee today to recognize. The other thing that we didn't talk about, but I can share, is that in a lot of cases these attacks will come at certain times of the day. So they will target an employee in the morning when they are crafting a lot of these emails, or they're going through their email, their big load of email that they got overnight, or they'll do it in the afternoon when people maybe are tired and they don't want to, they aren't necessarily as rigorous in identifying or analyzing emails. So it is tough. But let's talk about some things. I talked about some of the technology, that machine learning and expert rule technology that has been implemented in a number of Trend Micro products. So our Cloud App Security product, which supports Office 365 customers, it helps secure the email in that being used in Office 365. Whether you're using Box, Dropbox, or Google Drive, it can identify and help protect against that. This messaging technology is available there, so it will identify business email compromise if it comes through your Office 365 messaging platform. Our hosted email security, so we host the email for you. We can identify these and block them before they get into your organization. And then if you want an on-premise solution, there's Interscan Messaging Security, which is an on-premise email gateway security. It defends against, the business email compromise. Also ransomware. We've added a number of ransomware technologies to this as well. And a lot of these also you can support sandboxing. So if there is a malicious attachment, but like I said, most business email compromise, but in ransomware attacks, you're going to have an attachment usually. You can sandbox that and identify if it's a ransomware. So these products are all available, and you can take a look at them and try them out for free if you wanted to. So next steps really is if you do have more questions or you want to check out the Trend Micro products, you can speak to one of our representatives. There's a number here you can call, or you can email us, sales@trendmicro.com. We'd love to hear from you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Roger to see if we have any questions out there.
Thank you, John. We do have a number of questions that I'm going to jump right into, and I'm just going to throw these out for either you or Michael to respond to. First one is there another threat like business email compromise that you think is picking up steam?
I could take that, and Mike, you might have some other ideas, but one of the threats that we talked about, and we coined the phrase business process compromise. It's different from business email compromise. Business email compromise is really targeting the user. Business process compromise is targeting your organization's processes, especially if you're in the financial sector, where they will look at your process, they'll analyze your process over time, and then they will implement some hack that will allow them to either transfer money to themselves automatically through the transaction process, or they'll compromise your banking account customers, and they'll be able to send that. We saw this is one of the examples of this is the SWIFT attack, the Bangladesh bank threat. We think this is going to be a bigger threat coming forward. The losses are much, much higher in the millions of dollars with this threat. But again, it's kind of taking, we coined it as business process compromise because it's somewhat similar, but it's going after processes, not people. Michael, is there a threat that you have seen that you'd be interested in talking about?
Yeah, I would certainly agree about the business process compromise. And really what that points to is the need to really have good network security as well. I mean, we've all heard about dwell time, where, people have reported that, it's anywhere from 120 to 145 days where the cyber criminal can enter the network and they can just poke around and look for things before they launch an attack. And we're seeing, these these attacks that stretch out over many months where the bad guys are looking around at business processes. They're looking at, who you send wire transfers to, the frequency, the amounts, the time of day, and all of these things. And they really study their marks, and they study their targets so that, when they launch this attack, it's very believable. When the CFO receives the request to send a wire transfer to this particular supplier, it just fits right into the business process, and it's part of making it much less detectable. So I think, really understanding the level of penetration that the bad guys get into is critical as well. And you need to have good network security to be able to sort of ferret these things out.
Good points. Good points.
All right, we have time for one more question here, and that is, what department within an organization would you focus on first for phishing training?
Well, that's a good question. Obviously, phishing emails are going to target many different groups inside the organization, depending on what the attacker wants to accomplish. For business email compromise, certainly it's your finance. So I would probably talk to your finance people first and educate your finance people around this. The beauty thing about business email compromise, Roger, though, is it doesn't really, the main thing that you can do to protect you against it is to educate those financial people that if they get an email asking to do a wire transfer, they do the verification process, a step. As soon as they do that step, they will, obviously, the person, the CEO or CFO, wherever that's coming from, is going to obviously say, you know, no, I did not authorize this or request it. So that's going to shut it down very quickly, which is a great thing because it's just really a process that you have to put in place, an education that you have to put in place to really mitigate this threat.
Well, we'll have to wrap it up with that. So, John, I want to thank you for great recommendations and advice, and Michael, great research insights. So at this point, I want to also thank Trend Micro for making it possible for us to bring everyone today's event. We did get some inquiries with regards to getting copies of the presentation, and a representative from Trend Micro will be reaching out to everyone. So if you're interested in getting a copy, they can help you with that. And also, recording of today's presentations will be made available on the msexchange.org site in the future. So please watch your email for that. This will conclude today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us again, and you may now disconnect.
Thank you all.